like my number one job is to keep people alive, preventable death. That's number one. And the number two is getting them to return back to normal as fast as possible. And so, in terms of preventable death and hurricanes, there's a lot you can do to get out.
A lot of people should be rethinking their location. Anybody, I like to say, below 15 feet elevation, whether that's from the coast or from a river or even a creek. If you're, you can have flash flooding with these very intense rains. Better be thinking, what can I do to mitigate the risk that I have?
I'm George Siegel, and this is the Tell Us How to Make It Better podcast. Every week, we introduce you to people who are working on real-world problems and providing actual solutions. Tell Us How to Make It Better is partnering with the Readiness Lab, the home for podcasts, webinars, and training in the field of emergency and disaster services. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me on the Tell Us How to Make It Better podcast. This is the start of my second season doing this. And for the first episode, I had planned on going to a local organic farm. Actually, I had the segment already. And that's how I wanted to start off. But then Hurricane Ian hit. And that changed everything. As anybody knows who's following any kind of news, especially if you aren't in Florida, you probably have to have seen the devastation in Southwest Florida. That storm was supposed to hit Tampa. It was forecast for days to hit Tampa. That's where I live. And seeing what happened in Southwest Florida is just, not only does your heart break for the people who are suffering it, for the people here, it makes you go, first, wow, I dodged a bullet. But beyond that, I think it has to make you think, what would that have been like if it hit here? What kind of damage would we have faced? And what would be ahead for us after that storm had passed? When you see areas like Sanibel, Naples, Fort Myers Beach, it's going to be years for those places to get back together. And so we know the tragedy there. We saw it in my documentary film, The Last House Standing, with Mexico Beach, when Hurricane Michael just devastated that area. It was an older community, and so people here could go, well, that was a totally different situation. You can't say that now because it's not a totally different situation. We saw the path. We saw the blueprint for what could happen here. And so what I find curious and what I want to focus on today is, how will that change anything? What can people do here to think differently? And here could apply to anywhere along the Gulf Coast. It could apply to anywhere up the East Coast, anywhere prone to a hurricane. And you could take it beyond that to anyone prone to a disaster in their area. So I have a couple guests on today that are experts in talking about this kind of stuff, John Scardena and At.Aris Papadopoulos. And we're going to talk to them about their thoughts on Ian and what that means for other areas. Joining me is the CEO of Doberman Emergency Management, John Scardena. Doberman focuses on protecting life, property, and continuity of operations through planning, operations, and training. John, thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Happy to be here, George. It's good to see you again, and big fan of your film.
I appreciate that. The Last House Standing is what John is referring to, and we did that film focusing on Mexico Beach, truly the last house standing after the hurricane there. And John, you were kind of following along. I was making a montage of videos that I was posting as we were preparing for the storm for Ian to hit here in Tampa. Those are kind of thrown out the window now. They don't have the same impact because of the devastation that is to our south. First off, your thoughts on Ian as a professional in this industry.
So about 12 hours before Ian hit, I had a friend contact me and said, Tampa Bay is going to get slammed. And all I sent back to him was, just wait. Hurricane Matthew in particular reminded me that hurricanes can shift at the last second. And so the cone of uncertainty is real. And when we start playing into what the media tells us, and really, like, I do this too, right? Like, you look at the cone of uncertainty and you say, okay, in the middle path, Tampa. And so, of course, Tampa had to look out. But I think, gosh, my heart just goes out to a lot of people who got slammed in Fort Myers and down a little bit more south, I believe, and really across the state. I heard stories from, all the way up to Orlando and beyond. And so now that it's getting back into warmer waters, My heart just goes out to everybody. But again, when it comes to hurricanes and the cone of uncertainty, just wait. Prepare all the outlier areas as well, and you'll be much better prepared.
I don't think that the meteorologists and the Hurricane Center are, because I watch this stuff, every second. And they were talking about don't just pay attention to the center, especially since the U.S. model was on the left, the European model was on the right, going down where the storm ended up pretty much going, maybe a little further south than that. But it was in the cone. And so they weren't caught off guard. And I don't want to criticize or second guess anybody down there. They have a tragedy to deal with. What I want to focus on more is, okay, so for areas like Tampa, it makes you go, I thought we were as prepared as we could be. I thought we had all the things in place that would make it less of a tragedy. And now I'm thinking, wow, does anything matter? If a hurricane like that hits you, are you just, it doesn't seem like anything it just is frightening to see what happens. Those people's lives are changed forever.
So I will say, yes, there are things you can do. And there's a lot you can do as an individual. There's a lot you can do as a community. We talk about, now this is kind of off topic, but whether it's active shooters or hurricanes, distance is your friend. As an individual, like my number one job is to keep people alive, preventable death. That's number one. And the number two is getting them to return back to normal as fast as possible. And so in terms of preventable death and hurricanes, there's a lot you can do to get out. On the getting back to normal stuff, your film called it out. Building codes matter. Where you build matter. Insurance matters. The reality is, when a storm comes through like this, and it will come through, especially in Hurricane Alley, right, if you will, Florida and the Gulf Coast, as these storms come through, this shouldn't. I saw a word on social media that really blew me away. The word was incomprehensible damage. And my very first thought was incomprehensible. Like, I can comprehend this because we've seen hurricanes before. We know exactly what they do. Harrowing, yes. Terrible, yes. Terrifying, absolutely. But incomprehensible, we need to, as the professional side, we need to get much better at looking at building codes and preparing individuals and families for this kind of thing.
Now, I guess we won't know until, it's going to take months to analyze this. We're just getting studies now from Mexico Beach, what happened, and that was several years ago. But did the newer structures matter? Did evacuation plans matter? What we saw here in Tampa, and again, I say this is a great blueprint for us because you're never going to get a more clear-cut example of what that southwesterly approach can do to this part of Florida. This took the path that would literally wipe us out. So then you look at, okay, where did people evacuate? A lot of people here went to Orlando. Some people went because they thought they could have a couple days at Disney World and Universal Studios. Those people had more damage in Orlando than we ended up having here in Tampa. If you fled further north and the storm took that northerly path, if you had gone to Tallahassee or, anywhere up into Georgia, those places were in the path of the storm. So it kind of paralyzes you going, what do I do?
Go to Canada. Yeah. Even Canada got hit recently. Yeah.
Yeah.
I talked to somebody who said, hey, Tampa's going to get hit. You should head south, go to the Keys. Well, the Keys got hit. Yeah. And so, the reality is as much as destruction as there was, and you'll see this in the next several days as it comes through, and this will be a 10-year recovery like most major disasters. Everywhere has some level of impact. Some areas has catastrophic, some have minor. And if you look at the Red Cross shelters where they set up, they never set up in a flood zone. They get people out. And the very rare circumstances, I'm thinking Hurricane Katrina was one of them, where they didn't have that foresight. Now they do. And so there are places of safety and security that people can get to, even if they can't get, thousands of miles away to, Alaska, the North Pole, wherever it may be.
Well, when you listen to the reports, and what I was hearing yesterday was, I think it was Fort Myers Beach, the entire infrastructure, the power grid was destroyed. So it's not just putting up some utility poles and getting power back. You can't get to Sanibel Island anymore. The road is destroyed. And it's not like even after the earthquake in 89 in San Francisco, where the Bay Bridge collapsed, it was one section and they could focus on that and rebuild it. They may have to rebuild this entire causeway. Mm-hmm. So the disruption, when you use words like incomprehensible, I think for us laymen, we're not in your field where you study this and know all that stuff. It is incomprehensible. When I talk to my neighbors and people around Tampa, and people are walking around like, whoa, did we just get lucky? And so my thought is, okay, what does that mean now going forward? What does we just got lucky mean? Would you not ride out the next storm? Are you going to actually get a generator? We lost power for a minute. My next door neighbor has been without power since the storm hit. Spectrum, which I think is the worst internet service in the world. Those guys, when Irma hit here, they went out before the storm hit and were out for a week afterwards. We have Frontier. They never lost power, but a lot of people are still without internet. So we got a minor taste here, but it does scaring people. What would that mean now for Tampa? I'm going to interview the emergency managers here and people as they are able to have time down the road. But what changes? Because they seemed really prepared. I was impressed with the level of preparation that they were talking about here, but none of that would have mattered if that storm had hit here.
Right. So going back to the incomprehensible comment, incomprehensible, I like what you said. For the everyday person, yes, it is comprehensible. If I go through, personal story, my son had to go to the hospital. As an individual, it was incomprehensible. How do we get here? I'm worried about my son. I'm worried about my wife. Those kind of things, and that's incomprehensible. For a doctor, it should not be. A doctor should be professional and understand the level of impact, critical infrastructure impacts. Like I said earlier, it will take 10 years to recover from a major disaster. Critical infrastructure is impacted. Puerto Rico is a great example. Maria went through, destroyed their critical infrastructure, power included, roads included, and you had another hurricane just go right through, and it destroyed the same bridges that they put up. And so what do you do? And it is scary, right? Honestly, Tampa Bay did dodge a bullet. I mean, and you're talking a real bullet here. And so it's really fascinating to see it from all sides of the angle, especially those local emergency managers, and hats off to them. Those men and women, they're probably already exhausted, and they'll be doing this for several more weeks, if not months to come. And so all those responders, the linemen who go out there and restore that power, you see the exhaustion. And so my call out for individuals, when you see somebody sitting down in a subway, that lineman trying to eat a sub, please be patient with that person, because they're probably pretty exhausted themselves.
Yeah, you got to give people a little space, because you have no idea the depth of what they're going through. I'm just curious to see how things change here, because when I interviewed people here, we were talking about what they did called the Hurricane Phoenix scenario, which was done back around 2010. The population has exploded here, and I was reading how they did a reboot of it around 2020. And with the growth of this place, they said $300 billion worth of losses, 50 million tons of wreckage. 70% of the businesses in Pinellas County would be destroyed, 60% in Tampa. Downtown Tampa would be under potentially 20 feet of water. All of South Tampa, 12 to 15 feet. Our house could handle 10. Many others cannot. So when I was talking to the emergency guys for the film, they were saying, well, people need a wake-up call. Hopefully, Michael will be a wake-up call. I don't know that anything changed here. There's no way to deflect water like they have over in the Netherlands. So I just don't know how things are different. And what paralyzes me, I'm not a lifelong Floridian. I'm just a big chicken who wanted to move to Florida and loves it here. I consider this my home. But the two places I wanted to potentially move from here were Sanibel Island and Naples. Those are my favorite places. And it's just making me sick to see that and to think what that would have been like here. We would be living their tragedy.
I was talking to a friend who is on Pine Island, which is basically Fort Myers. If you look at Fort Myers Beach, it's just maybe 5 minutes down the road and or across the water. And I was FaceTiming a friend. And I said, hey, why are you still there? Because, he said, hey, I'm hunkering down. And I texted him back and said, well, you should get out. And he FaceTimed me. He goes, "Hey, I thought I was going to Tampa, and so I thought I could stay. I thought I could ride it out, and it shifted, and now we're stuck." And then you hear a loud boom, and the FaceTime died. He goes, "Oh," the FaceTime died. I tried to get in contact with him again. I contacted a lot of our friends who are down there, first responders, and hats off to them. The urban search and rescue, everybody lost contact. His family lost contact. Everybody lost contact with him. And it was the eye came through after the eye. I was trying to contact him. His cell phone was ringing, but I couldn't get a hold of him. Neither could anybody else. Well, 8 p.m. last night, several buddies took down a boat and found him. House destroyed. He had a one-story house on the water. House destroyed. His boat was gone. His business, he operates a lot of equipment out of a trailer. His trailer gone. But they found him helping his neighbors. And the most amazing part of that is he asked for a few supplies and he opted to stay. And so that was 8 p.m. last night. Just found him. And it shows, even when you're in the worst of circumstances, when you focus on other people, it's a way to survive. And the next several months will be a very difficult road for him. My heart goes out to him. And there are probably hundreds of those stories where, we look at that. Unfortunately, experience tells me that unless you're in Fort Myers, sometimes decision makers will think, well, we got lucky, we'll probably get lucky again. And that's just not the case. If you can wake up and do a little bit, then you can prevent this kind of stuff from happening.
Well, was he in an older home? Do you know what kind of house he had? Was it concrete?
I think it was a concrete home. I can only tell from the FaceTime video he was showing me. Concrete home. He had no windows towards the water.
If you're not elevated, even a concrete home's not going to survive that kind of storm surge. The houses that are 10, 15 feet up at least have a chance.
Yeah. I mean, when he was on, the wind was already going, and we watched a tree fall onto somebody's boat, just on the other side. And I was like, hey, you got to get out of here. So, but luckily he was okay. And unfortunately, some people are not. But again, there are things we can do. New Jersey woke up after Hurricane Sandy and said, now it's against the law to build on the water. They put dunes. They had destroyed all their natural dunes. They put the dunes back in, and lo and behold, big storms have come in there, and no surge. Surge is the thing that you look at the two types of death in hurricanes. It's surge, and it's generators. Those are the two number one causes of death, 1 and 2. And so if you can get surge to be minimalized, 20 feet of water in Tampa, that's a lot of surge to stop. And then, on the other hand, if you can teach people how to operate when there is no power safely, you could probably save a lot of lives that way too.
Yeah. And, it's people that are on those islands or in those places that suffered this kind of damage, like the people in Mexico Beach in the last house standing. If all the infrastructure around you is destroyed, your life is still displaced. You just maybe are a little more whole than everybody around you. I think what the interesting thing is for people here in Tampa, you're always faced with that flight, do I stay? Do I go down with the ship? I made that comment to you in a text. Or do you get out of here and save your life? But then you hear that people that left, that there was looting going on, and immediately people know who leaves and they go and they rob their house. Or afterwards, if you want to try to protect what few things you have left and you can't get back. So it's a tough decision. I think next time for sure I would get my family out of here, because the weight of that responsibility is just, I think I aged 10 years going, God, if this hits here and my family gets injured, I'm disposable, but I can't let anything happen to them. That's a horrible feeling.
If it makes you feel any better, you're not disposable to me, George.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, but it was a wake-up call for you, right? Yeah. You and I were talking as well during it, and I was like, oh man, this meteorologist, he's essentially a storm chaser. You have experience. You've also done things for yourself personally. And so you were looking to, I wouldn't say capitalize, but experience it and hopefully be okay. And I think it's also a wake-up call to say, hey, you were going to move to these areas that were destroyed, and you're like, not worth it. And that's good for a lot of people. When it comes to looting, I've heard a lot of the stories of looting, but I've also responded to several Type 1 events, and the looting is 100th of what is reported. The suspect. Yes, there are people who do that. Yes, it is horrible, and yes, it's stupid. But you are more important than your stuff, and hopefully you have insurance, and hopefully those things. So whether it got washed out in the water or pirate, I mean, basically that's what they are at that point. A pirate comes in and hijacks some of that stuff. That's probably already damaged by the water, to be honest. Not as important as your life.
Yeah, now here in Tampa, a few 100,000 people are still without power, and we didn't even get the hurricane. We got the weakest winds that you could get from a storm that powerful, and 200,000 people are without power. I think the generator business, maybe this will wake people up. You can walk around and you know who has a generator because you can hear those things from blocks. Yeah. But I don't know why anybody wouldn't have that. It's like, I don't know why anyone in Oklahoma wouldn't have a storm cellar. I don't know why anyone in California wouldn't have a house that is to code to at least survive an earthquake. It's like, why do people make such horrendous gambles or poor decisions with their most valuable possession?
So this is a tough one for me because ultimately I believe in personal responsibility, but I get it. I think a lot of people, I think if they had the means, they would do it. And I think when you prioritize limited resource, including funding, you hope that it is a 1 in a million chance, and you're not. I'm actually more concerned that the person who plays lottery is not worried about getting struck by lightning. Like, if you believe in those kind of odds, that you would believe that you get struck by lightning and be more serious about it. But like, it's the same kind of concept, right? Like, we all prioritize, and we have a culture that we don't address a problem until it's right in front of our face. The problem with that mentality, though, is that the just the scope of how big these things are, you can't address it at the last minute. It's impossible. You have to do things when it's blue sky. President Kennedy said it best, right? The best time to fix the roof is when it's sunny. That is the mentality that emergency managers have adopted. However, culturally speaking, especially in the U.S., it is it goes against the norm for sure.
So, what advice would you have for people in Tampa, for people in St. Pete, for people in Clearwater that look at what happened south of us? What would you tell them they need to do going forward?
I think the number one thing I would tell people is, first of all, count your blessings. Not everybody was so lucky. And interestingly enough, if you have a spirit of gratitude, this is going to be kind of funny, but when people are grateful that, this time I was the one who got lucky, so I'm going to help out other people. I think when people start looking at that, they get away from the fallacies of, well, it'll never happen to me. I got lucky, therefore I should do something so I can remain lucky. And if you want to be more specific, there's companies out there that can protect homes. They have these barriers that you can put up. There's communities that I would go after. I would work with the city so much to say, hey, we were going to be under 20 feet of water. What are you going to do about it? And hold them accountable if they don't. Building codes matter. Urban planning matters. Where you live and working with your neighbors matter. One of the biggest problems I have with doomsday preppers is they have this mentality that they can do it all by themselves. There's not a single case study in the history of the world where a person doing something by themselves doesn't drive them crazy. If you're alone, you will go crazy. It's much better to work with a community. Hurricane Katrina was a great example of that. There was a micro community in Louisiana, a Vietnamese community. The average recovery time in Louisiana was 7 years. They recovered in like 6 weeks. Wow. Because they all worked together. They found the supplies. They had what I would call memorandum of understanding. They worked with different businesses. So from an individual perspective, get to know your neighbors, get emergency supplies, have a plan, get out, all the basic stuff you hear all the time. Businesses, on the other hand, you said 70% of the businesses were wiped out. Nationally speaking, 40% of businesses, small businesses, don't come back after a major disaster. Having a business continuity plan, even with your competitors, saying, hey, if we both get wiped out, we're going to see if we can survive together. Having those legal systems in place to be able to operate. Insurance matters. Gosh, there's so many different things. People forget that insurance is a first come, first serve. So the faster that you can get your insurance company involved, the faster you will recover. Even if you're like, oh, great, I have insurance, I get to make a claim. Well, guess what? It might be like years before they get to you, right? And water damage years later is pretty hard to prove. So it's gosh, there's plans, insurance, get out, know your community. That's what I would say.
Don't you find people have short memories? I mean, it's like when you're driving down the street and you almost get in an accident and you have that adrenaline rush, and then you drive on and you forget about it. If you're, if something bad happens, you have a bad medical test and you think you have cancer, and then you find out you don't. People have short memories. That's what when we've interviewed people, mayors have said, yeah, 5 years from now, this will be a memory for people, and they're going to go on. How do you get them to say, okay, this is real, let's make a difference?
Unfortunately, historically speaking, it takes another dramatic experience to do that. The best way to overcome that is through training and exercising. And so like it keeps that memory fresh. Some memories sear, right? Fort Myers will forever remember this disaster. Louisiana, especially, New Orleans will forever remember Hurricane Katrina. And there's several disasters like that. However, the adjacent communities need to be working with, interview, get to know, especially from an organizational perspective. It is now a responsibility, as soon as this disaster is over, a responsibility of the community leaders in Fort Myers to warn and work with the community leaders in other areas to help it keep it fresh in their mind. I mean, look at World War II. In Europe, this is, again, slightly off topic, but again, a reference point. I was called in to work with NATO because they wanted to understand mass population migration, right? Even though they're seeing that with Syria, they're preparing for Russia to enter into Europe. All those lessons lost of Europe being destroyed, their infrastructure being destroyed, and how that population will react, all those lessons have been lost. And so now they're looking at emergency managers and saying, hey, you deal with, large scale population change all the time. How do you handle that? So working with them.
Well, you hope it's the wake up call that really does get to people. I mean, I know it's gotten to me. I'm not affected by much. I'm pretty much a sarcastic, nothing really bothers me guy.
Yeah.
And I'm rattled by this one. And I can only imagine, I can't really imagine how other people are going to deal with it or how they feel, but I hope they take it seriously.
Well, let me change the table on you a little bit. What are you going to do differently?
I think it'll change my plans, how I would protect my family right after, or when the disaster is before it happens, knowing that they're in a place that they would be safe. I think I want to reevaluate understanding what the flood level is, because we think we would be okay because we have a newer home. And I want to make sure that we've done everything we can to get to a place where if that place will be safe, we can get back easily to try to rebuild afterwards, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out. Understanding the difference between a crisis and a disaster. You don't always have to let a crisis become a disaster. If you can think, your first line of defense is always the ability to think, right? And you're already looking at the future like, okay, this is still hurricane season, by the way. 2 weeks, another system could pop up in the Gulf. And if that happens, leave. Just leave. Distance is your friend. You're talking about being on the outer bands, and it wasn't really that bad. You're looking at the difference between that, a couple hundred miles, right? Between you. How far is Fort Myers from you?
It's a less than 2 hour. It's about a 2 hour drive, maybe less.
Okay. A 2 hour drive can, change your whole life.
Yeah.
Right. You can come back and survey the damage. And I hope that your home is never impacted. But if it is, I'll be the first one there to help you out, George. But
Well, I appreciate that.
seriously.
But it does change your thinking. And I used to do a lot of live television where I was out in storms, and you had to be thinking all the time in a disaster situation. You lose that ability, and most people are paralyzed during a disaster. You sit there going, now I can't think anything straight. I just want to watch the coverage, and you end up just doing nothing. And so you can't say enough how much you have to have a plan in advance.
I was on a studio set just no. What was it? 5 days ago? 5 days ago, a wooden prop. It was a large crane, essentially, that was supposed to be hauling up rock. But the crane fell. It was unstable and it fell in the mud. And everybody got out of the way except for a 17-year-old kid. I think he was 17. He looks up and he went like this. I mean, that would have put him in the ground, essentially. I mean, literally, like a hammer into the ground. He's so small compared to the thing. But luckily, somebody screamed at him again and he got out of the way and nobody got hurt. It was fine. But somebody said, hey, why don't you move? He's like, I wanted to, but all I could think was to do this.
Yeah.
And that is the natural tendency. I think it's the same reason why, if we see like a train on fire, we all want to watch instead of get out. It's like fasting. It seems like incomprehensible, going back to that word. Like, is this really possible? Like, this is outside of the norm so much. Well, you fast forward and, people do this in hurricanes. They do this in every disaster, even if they want to. This is why I'm a little more understanding than I used to be. Even if they want to, they feel like they can't, or they're just paralyzed by the shock of it. Speaking of which, did you see the weatherman who was hit by the tree?
Yeah, Jim Cantori. And then he went back out afterwards. And I got to tell you, I think I admire those guys. I think they're great meteorologists. But that's the stupidest thing. How are they benefiting anybody's life by being out there? I think they would have more benefit being behind the shelter and showing us really good pictures. But the stupidity of putting yourself in a life-threatening situation when you don't have to goes against every bit of rational thinking that exists.
Well, it actually tells people that they can do it too.
Yeah.
Like, oh, he's out there. I could do it. That looks fun. So you have that problem. Actually, the number one thing that has gotten people to leave is not by telling people to write their social security number on their forearm with a permanent marker. It's not by telling them that first responders can't save them. The number one thing that has happened is actually, I think it's from the Weather Channel, but it could be from NOAA as well. They'll have a graphic of a person and a house, and they'll show how high the water will be in comparison. Yeah. And we've gotten more positive feedback. So I'm like, that got me to leave. Like, I didn't realize, like, my house when they say flooding, you think it's in the street, or you think like, oh, hopefully it doesn't come up to the tires of my car or my driveway. No. Your floor is gone. And that has gotten people to leave. And I hope we use that more of that imagery where somebody doesn't actually have to be out there, but movie magic, whatever you might want to call it, gets people to start moving.
All right, John. Hey, thank you so much for your time this morning. As always, you have brilliant information that I think people will really benefit from listening to, and I hope they do.
George, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Please contact me anytime, and I hope your house never gets nailed by a hurricane.
Thank you.
Yeah,
appreciate that. Joining me now is At.Aris Papadopoulos, who literally wrote the book about how we need to make better choices on where we live and what we live in. Aris is an international pioneer in consumer-driven resilience. He was named a distinguished expert in resilience at Florida International University and wrote the book, Resilience, the Ultimate Sustainability. I've had Aris on a couple of times. Aris, welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, George. Good to see you, and happy to talk to your audience.
Yeah, this completely changed a lot of people's lives forever. In an insignificant way, it changed what I was doing, because that storm was supposed to hit Tampa, where I live, and I was documenting our preparations and what was going to happen. And now I feel really stupid. It's like, wow, none of that would have mattered. We would have been wiped out.
Yeah, I don't know where exactly elevation-wise and distance from the coast you are, but definitely this was the real McCoy. It was a Andrew kind of size event. So, we're fortunate it didn't hit Miami. We're fortunate it didn't hit Tampa directly, but it did hit a very developed part of Florida, and obviously has crossed the state and has done damage on the northeastern side and now headed to the Carolinas.
Now, what I'm not doing is I'm not showing a lot of images of what Ian did down there, because everybody can see those. You can get those anywhere. But what I was interested in having the theme of the podcast be about is, okay, so how do people react to this that were not in that area? I know when we made The Last House Standing, we talked about, Hurricane Michael and how it hit Mexico Beach. But this is completely different, because this was not an older community that was not even close to code. So I guess my first question would be, do you know how strong a code they had in those areas? And then we're still seeing that kind of damage.
Yes, well, you're looking at decades of housing. I just yesterday was kind of looking at the Fort Myers Beach area just to get an idea of when a lot of those properties were built. And you do have some properties built in the 20s, some properties built in the 40s, 50s, and then you have recent properties in the 90s and after 2000. So you have a pretty wide segment of properties. And my guess would be that what we've seen destroyed is not what has been built in the last 20, 25 years. It's mostly what has been built before that. But that's to be confirmed. But that's my original guess. The key point here is that our building stock still has a lot of vulnerable properties, even in very hazard-prone areas. And if you're looking to move into a property, make double sure you understand what you're looking at. Yes, it may be pretty. It may have had this, interior renovated and look nice. But if you're looking at a property that was built to a standard of, let's say, 80 miles an hour or 90 or 100, and you're in a zone that could be impacted by Category 4 or even 5 in the future, you better take caution.
Now, if that storm, if Hurricane Ian had hit South Florida, the southeast part of the state, how would you imagine Miami and Fort Lauderdale and Boca and all those areas would have held up? Because a lot of them have the toughest building codes in the country. How do you think that they might have fared? I know you said you're glad you didn't hit there. Of course. I mean, we all are glad when it misses us, but what do you think would have happened?
Well, this was a combined wind and water event. Obviously, we saw significant storm surge in the order of 10, 15 feet plus in locations. So wind-wise, I would expect that Southeast Florida would have fared quite well. Obviously, there's still some older buildings that were not affected by Andrew further north of Homestead and those South Miami areas that could have been damaged, but a lot fewer than what we're seeing now from this Ian impact. But the storm surge would have been devastating in the coastal part of Miami Beach, even the coast along Biscayne Bay. So you would have had some pretty serious flood damage to properties that are within, let's say, less than 15 feet elevation from the water.
Yeah, I was reading the updated Hurricane Phoenix scenario for Tampa before the hurricane hit. And they were talking about how some areas would have 20 feet of water in them. Downtown St. Petersburg would be an island now, and they named the one spot that might be above water. Where I live, the flood level is 10 feet. It seems like we would have had water in our house if that had hit here. How do you think this is going to change people's mentality going forward? I know it's changed mine. I'm not a lifelong Floridian, but this is my home. I love this place, but it scared the hell out of me.
Well, I know it's scary, and I know it's a moment people kind of think, but it's important for us to think about that. That's one of the most important choices we have to make as individuals, where we live and in what we live in. So, a lot of people should be rethinking their location. Anybody, I'd like to say, below 15 feet elevation, whether that's from the coast or from a river or even a creek, if you're, you can have flash flooding with these very intense rains, better be thinking, what can I do to mitigate the risk that I have? And obviously, people that are in homes that were built to lower standards of wind, particularly, within a few miles of the coast, should be thinking the same thing. What do I do? Can I do something, or do I need to tear this, house totally down and rebuild from scratch and do things differently? So I think that's an important thought. I mean, other people may say I'm packing up and leaving. I'm heading for higher ground, so to speak.
Yeah.
But for those who stay, I think it's important to say, what am I going to prioritize? And second, how do I get, the funding to do that? Obviously, there's been a lot of appreciation in Florida during the last 2-3 years. A lot of people have moved during the COVID crisis from the north to the south. So, a lot of properties have appreciated. A lot of people are sitting on, much higher equity. Land has appreciated. So, can you use part of that equity to say, okay, I'm going to build either an add-on, and if I'm a 2-story house, I'm converting the existing first story to just, an open area, for ping pong tables or whatever, but something that, I don't care if it floods or not. And I'll just use the second story of the existing house, and then I'll add on something stronger next to it or right behind it, in which, I'll kind of connect the second floor, and that's where I'll live.
Now, all the newer homes that are being built in South Tampa and around Tampa they have to be 10 or 11 feet. I think they might have raised it in some areas to 11. But if Ian had hit here, I'm probably half a mile from the bay, not from the coast.
Mm-hmm.
You think we would have got 15 feet of water here? And then it's all the damage that piles into your house from other structures that are older.
Mm-hmm.
I would say Tampa is very much like Naples and Fort Myers in the sense that you have that mixture in the community. You have the really old homes and the really new ones. And it's a scary blueprint because that was the exact path that is our doomsday path here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so much of this depends on terrain. The water moves along what is its easiest path, and its easiest path is not to climb up, is just to go in the lowest part of the terrain. So, if the terrain is totally flat, theoretically, the water will spread evenly unless there are obstructions that we have built. But let's say that even, east of the bay where you are, let's say it's just a little bit hilly, just some areas a little higher, some areas are a little lower. The water will tend to go in those lower areas. I mean, those areas will be where the water is kind of reaching in. And if you're there, you're going to feel the impact of that surge as it floods the bay and kind of makes its way further, inland, and could be affected by wind. If the wind is behind that, kind of moving it, it will push the water much stronger inland than it would be if the wind is not behind it. I mean, these are all things you gotta think about when you're planning the future, the tough decisions for everyone. And I guess you're in that thought process yourself.
Yeah, when we were making the last house standing and we were talking to local officials here, they were saying, well, Hurricane Michael hopefully is a wake-up call. And I know that those professionals do a lot of stuff behind the scenes that we probably don't know about. But it seems like a lot of the stuff they do is preparing for how to handle after the storm hits. Mm-hmm. If they're doing stuff in front of that to make us safer, I'm not aware of it. And so it might exist, but I just don't know about it. How could this not be the ultimate wake-up call to everybody? Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of lifelong Floridians it's very hard for a storm to hit Tampa because they turn to the right. But this was close.
Well, again, we focus on the response. We focus on often the hazard too much. We don't focus on what we are responsible for, which is our own development. And, that is not talked enough, and it's easily forgotten. But there's one thing that is very clear to me: the insurance industry was facing troubles before Ian. We had like 6 or so insurance companies in Florida that went insolvent, and there are many reasons for that. The reinsurance market has become very difficult. They can't get inexpensive reinsurance like they were getting years ago, and and reinsurance is in fact the insurance for insurers. Inflation has been a factor. Their costs have gone up, as have been costs of claims, and also litigation has been a higher rising cost in Florida. I don't know if you know this, but Florida historically over the last decade or so has had like 10% of the national claims and like 80% of the national litigation on claims. So, we have, in the legislature in Florida has tried to solve this, but not satisfactorily. So, that's been, driving insurers out of the state. So, imagine now what might lie ahead after they've paid out tens of billions of dollars and are saying, we don't want to be in the state. And in fact, the state has imposed now a 60-day kind of moratorium on cancellations and dropping policies and so forth. But what will happen after the 60 days or after the 90 days and so forth? People are going to make their choices from the insurance side and either say, we've got to double the premiums, or we're just stepping out of the state, and where's that going to leave you? So if you're going to be more and more self-insured, so to speak, because the deductibles are going to go up, the costs are going to go up for premiums, you've got to take these matters of resilience about where you live, what kind of property you have into your own hands and make your choices. And people need more information, and you're doing your part with this podcast. I'm doing as much as we can, but we gotta get the media and more people talking about this in the months and years after this event.
It's another thing that's challenging too is where people go if they do leave. A lot of people from Tampa went to Orlando. Orlando got it worse than Tampa. So you want to say, okay, if I'm going to get out, where do I go? The time to make that plan is now for the next one, not right when the next one is barreling down on you. The people in Fort Myers, though, they were in the cone. It just, nobody was talking about that being a scenario. It was like everybody was focused on Tampa.
Yeah, and in fact, Tampa got the most of the attention, and obviously, Tampa is much more dense, and from the Bay side, has much higher risk. But Fort Myers, that the Naples area and so forth, you have a mix of people there. There's some people who have come down and said, okay, I'm coming down here to retire, and that's even riskier because if you're an older person, you probably have restrictions in terms of mobility, your ability to respond and so forth. You want to be like me in a low risk, very resilient house. I urge retirees, and I'm trying to get the AARP that I'm a member of to put an article, talking about this subject. I haven't been successful yet because retirees have to be thinking about where they're going to. So you have that big class of people. Then you have people who basically have vacation homes. Yes, they have their primary home somewhere else. Hopefully, it's in a more resilient location and place. And they basically say, okay, that's my vacation house. I have somewhere else to go. I'm not going to worry about it. I have my boat slip there. Hopefully, some of them have the financial capacity to afford this kind of loss. Then you have people that are in the lower kind of levels of economics that basically live in manufactured houses and mobile houses. Those are really, I call them like basically live in coffins. They're the first that are going to get wiped out, destroyed. And hopefully they have the sense to evacuate quickly because they are the most vulnerable. So you still have a lot of those, and I can't believe how many manufactured and mobile homes we have in vulnerable states like Florida. Hundreds of thousands. In fact,
you and I have talked about this before. Okay, what kind of memory do people have? Michael might not have been enough of a wake-up call for people. Now we have Ian. When I've talked to people after a disaster, some of the officials or the mayor or whatever will say, people will forget about this in 5 years. And they'll just be going on with their lives, but not the people in Naples and Fort Myers and Sanibel. it could be 5 to 10 years before those areas, and some of them may never recover based on what we're hearing. So people have to understand the path to recovery, maybe never.
Yes, exactly. And as we saw in New Orleans, some people may just pick up and leave for good, and that can affect obviously businesses, the economy, et cetera. And you and I worked on this Mexico Beach kind of post disaster survey. We saw there the difficulties people had, and these were generally, it was a small area, and these were generally middle income people, with decent incomes and so forth. And it's taken 3, 4, maybe even more years to recover. And the difficulties they faced, even when they were insured to collect the funds they needed to rebuild.
So, for people that are not in the areas that were hit, what advice would we leave with them for how they should process Hurricane Ian? Because the people that are in it, there's not much we can do for them other than give financial support and support any way we can. But for the people around there, like the people here, the people in South Florida, what advice would you have for them?
Well, the first step is to do a self-assessment. I almost think of it like a health assessment. You go through you hear about a friend, let's say, who had a severe health issue, and you look at yourself and you see the similarities, and you kind of say, I've got to change my lifestyle. If I want to extend my life, and live in a proper way. So we need to do, each of us needs to do a property assessment. And, I'm trying to provide tools for doing that on my website, buildingresilient.com. I have the buyer's guide. I'm working right now on kind of an adaptation, kind of self-exam, a self-quiz that you can take, to see whether you should be adopting early. And if yes, what kind of adaptation you should be doing. Other resources include online and are for free Flood Factor. Go there and check what your flood risk is. You just have to enter your property. They're not going to try to sell you anything. It's a nonprofit, and they have suggestions there too as to what you can do. So, doing a self-assessment, I think wherever you are is the first step. And then developing a plan, an action plan. And if you are planning to spend any money on your house, any renovation money, make sure that you prioritize items that will make your house less vulnerable, that will make it more resilient. Yes, you may like that, kitchen to that new kitchen or that, fancy bathroom or doing something cosmetic, but, you're going to lose it all if, what you're sitting on is a vulnerable property. So, the first priority should be, if I need to replace a roof, let me go to a hurricane rated roof instead of just a code roof. The code may say you're good with a roof at 130 miles an hour, but maybe you should put a roof that's for 170 miles an hour, windows and doors and garage doors. The code may say, okay, you can go with an ordinary door that's good for 100 miles an hour, 110 miles an hour, but maybe you need to put a hurricane rated door and windows and be safe on that side. So all these kind of things, there's a whole list of things that you should be prioritizing if you're looking to stay in that house and renovate it. Obviously, if you're in a low location, your choices become tougher because they become more expensive. A number of people are looking at elevating homes. And yes, you can elevate a house, but depending on its size and its weight, it may cost, a couple $100,000 to do that. Or if you're permitted to build more on that, site, you may add on, as I mentioned earlier, a new extension to the house that will be more resilient. So there's a list of choices. Unfortunately, we don't have that many people helping homeowners kind of go through that. It'd be more useful if governments spend time helping consumers in that rather than telling them, okay, make sure you got your medicine, make sure you got your bought your water. Things like that, I mean, they tell us, the stuff, just a few days before the event, but then they forget about us during the rest of the year.
And of course, all that goes out the window if you have a 20-foot storm surge and the infrastructure of your community is entirely wiped out. Even the best planning can lead to a bad outcome.
Yeah, there are certain areas that unfortunately maybe we have to return back to nature eventually.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things for people to take away is you make the plan in advance, because I can tell you firsthand, as it gets closer to you, your brain doesn't work the same way. You are captured by coverage, watching what's unfolding, and you're almost paralyzed to the point of that's not the time you want to start going, okay, where could we go? What should we do? And you do that on a nice day.
Exactly.
Aris,
absolutely.
Hey, yeah. I appreciate you coming on. As always, a bunch of great information, and I encourage everybody to read your book, Resilience, the Ultimate Sustainability. That should be a must read for anybody that wants to have a house anywhere.
Thank you, George. Appreciate the plug, and I'm here to help communicate this. This has become my life purpose as a retired construction veteran and also a World Trade 9/11 survivor to communicate to the public what they can do.
Thank you so much for listening to today's Tell Us How to Make It Better podcast. Certainly a very sad and tragic situation that people are going to be experiencing now for years. And I guess we'll see if that changes anybody's thought process of whether they want to continue to live where they're living or if they'll do something to make where they are living safer. If you want to get a hold of John or Aris, their information is in the show notes. And if you have any questions or comments for me, if you know somebody who was affected by the disaster, I have a contact form in the show notes. It's also on my website, tellus.howtomakeitbetter.com. And if they want to talk, if they want to talk about their situation or what they're going to do going forward, I would certainly love to hear from you and hear from them. So that's there for you to reach out. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.